Welcome to the 707, a weekly half-hour program produced by KRCB, a service of NorCal Public Media. The 707 features voices and stories from your community, stories that explore our local history, and stories that show how we are connected to each other. I'm your host, Michelle Marques. The year is 1579. A privateer from England is sailing along the California coast and looking for a safe place to repair his galleon, which is filled with stolen silver from a Spanish treasure ship that he raided off the coast of Ecuador during a voyage up the coasts of South and Central America. The Northern California coastline with its white cliffs reminded his homesick crew of similar white cliffs in England, and their hopes of finding a safe harbor were rewarded. The spot? Drake's Bay along the Point Reyes Seashore. For centuries, scholars have wondered where Sir Francis Drake made land. That piece of history is explored by a group called the Drake Navigators Guild. Each summer, they host talks and hikes to take history buffs to the spot where Drake brought his ship, the Golden Hind, to make repairs and replenish supplies before sailing home to England.
The Drake Navigators Guild, though, was different. They were a group of historians, archaeologists, sailors, all kinds of disciplines, looking at the question of what can we learn, what can we know about our early visitors. So since 1949, they've been doing the research. In the early 60s, they actually kind of figured out exactly where Drake landed, and that's where we're going to go. And in 2012, they are responsible for making this into a National Historic Landmark. I can talk about that. And in 2021, this became a California Historical Landmark. So our job at this point, or our interest, is educating the public. Almost everybody knows about the term Francis Drake. Very few people know much more.
That's Michael von der Porten, president of the Drake Navigators Guild, speaking to our group at the Ken Patrick Visitor Center on a foggy Saturday morning. There are photos and maps strewn about, which Michael uses to illustrate Drake's life.
When we talk about Marin and Sonoma County history, we don't usually talk about knights in shining armor. We don't usually talk about ships with fortresses, basically, at the front and the back of the ship. We don't talk about cannon, muzzle-loading cannon. We don't talk about religious wars, Protestant versus Catholic, the being tortured and perhaps dying under the Spanish Inquisition. We don't talk about national wars, England versus Spain. We don't talk about retribution. But those are exactly the elements that came here for 5 weeks in 1579.
Drake was the eldest of 12 boys and learned the sailing trade early in life. He became a captain at a young age during the era of the Spanish and Portuguese slave trade. Drake got involved in intercepting slave ships through his uncle, and it nearly cost both their lives. Soon, Drake began working as a privateer for the Queen of England, capturing silver from the Spanish in Panama, and he had some success there.
So then he comes up with this idea that, well, this is nice. What if we get into the Pacific Ocean and actually raid the Spanish? So he puts together his plan to get ships to go into the Pacific. He gets the Queen's endorsement. He gets the Queen's investment. He gets 5 ships. They set it up as a trading voyage. They're going to go to Alexandria, Egypt. They're going to go through the Med over to Egypt, and that's how it's set up. But that's what they told everybody. And that's tricky because in these voyages, they would have investors, gentlemen, who would go along on the voyage with some of their own investment or on behalf of a consortium of trading goods. So these people were on the boat on the ships expecting to go to Egypt, trade and make money. They leave in November of 1577. They almost immediately hit a storm. They lose a mast. They're forced back into Plymouth Harbor.
A month later, the ships instead headed across the Atlantic and then on to South America to begin raiding the Spanish, who had almost exclusive claim to the Pacific side of South and North America.
But as soon as they hit the Pacific coast, they hit the storm of all storms. And for 5 weeks, they were blown around. They were blown so far south that they discovered this was open ocean down here. Before that, this was all thought to be a continent connected to Antarctica. That's what we know it as, the Drake Passage. The Marigold was seen floundering in the surf, and they watched it go down with all hands. They probably lost 30 men. The Elizabeth, they had set up a latitude to meet if they got separated. Drake worked his way up there. The Elizabeth never showed up. The Elizabeth instead turned south, actually hung around the Straits of Magellan for a little while looking for Drake, and ultimately went home. So word gets back to England. 2 ships were burned, 1 sank with all hands. It was awful. Drake must be dead. And that's the word back in England. So they spend the time working their way up the coast. There are a number of small towns, ships, and as they show up each time, they have the element of surprise. No Spaniard thinks there's going to be an Englishman in town, in the area. They'd show up, they'd say, oh, of course, there's another Spanish ship coming into our port. And they go out to meet them, and suddenly it would be a boat with 20 armed Englishmen, and they'd flee into the hills. And the English would go into the town, take what they needed.
Drake continued his voyage up the coast with additional raids when he got word about the Spanish treasure ship.
They get word that, in effect, the Spanish are taunting him that you just missed the great ship with all the silver that was going to Panama. And you can't get them, they're already on their way. Well, of course, that was a challenge for Drake. Drake had the Golden Hind. It's a ship that's about 80 feet long. Hawkins was involved in the design of the ship. It's a double-hulled, fast ship. It's a galleon of the day. And Drake took that as a challenge. He put up all the sails, and they went sailing after that ship. And he was faster. And they caught up to it, and went in the distance, and then Drake had them throw barrels of water overboard so they would have all their sails up, look like a slow-moving Spanish merchantman. They pulled up along the ship, the Nuestra Senora de la Concepcion, or the Spitfire, or the Shitfire, and they announced they were English and said surrender, and they said nuts. Drake said fire the cannon. They fired the cannon once. They took down a mast, and the Spaniards surrendered. It took them 3 days to unload 26 tons of silver. They had 80 pounds of gold. They had some jewels and other goodies. The rock, the ballast that used to be in the bottom of the Golden Hind became Spanish silver.
By this point, news of Drake's exploits had made it back to Spain, and he couldn't head back south down the coast. So instead, the idea was to find the fabled Northwest Passage and sail around the top of North America back to England. At the time, there wasn't enough exploration to prove whether it existed. Spoiler alert, it didn't. And then Drake's galleon, the Golden Hind, wound up in trouble.
Anybody who's a sailor knows you don't sail northwest along the Pacific coast. You can't do it.
It's a lee coast.
It's a lee coast, yeah. So he was well out to sea. He didn't see anything until he couldn't go any further. The winds turned against him. So he sailed then east, and hoping the continent was going to do this, and it ran into Oregon. Okay, we're in Oregon. What's the Oregon coast like? Rocky, ugly. It's a terrible spot to be in a wooden boat. They hung around for a couple days in southern Oregon Dunes area, hoping that the winds would turn and they could go further north. The winds didn't turn. So now you're looking at option 3. And option 3 is we got to fix our ship and then we got to get across the Pacific. So he works his way down the coast, and as we talked about, the coast is rocky, ugly. There is not a good port on the entire coast between southern Oregon as you head south. When you come south and you get to here, if you're out at sea off Bodega Head out here, if you're looking south, what you see, of course, is this huge headland sticking out. And when you see a headland, you sail out and around it. You don't sail into Bodega Bay. You don't go into Tamales Bay. Those are extremely dangerous places. They're unknown. And there's actually a nautical term called embayed. To be embayed is to be caught in a bay from which you can't sail out. And any good sailor, Drake was a great sailor, sees this big headland, you sail out and around. And you fall into a convenient and fit harbor. And that's exactly what they call them.
Michael von der Porten says this is when Drake found the white cliffs that reminded his crew of England and a place where the Golden Hind could safely make repairs.
When they first got here, a single Native American, a Coast Miwok man, rode up in a two-lee balsa. And, I mean, imagine what he thought, seeing this giant boat, having experience with a two-lee balsa. They put some trade goods, some offerings, in effect, on a plank, and they slid them out to him. He wouldn't touch them. They took a red hat and they threw it in the ocean. He went off, picked it up, put it on his head, and paddled off. So they had to repair the ship. They built themselves a small fort. And it's basically a small embankment with wood and rock to protect themselves. Again, they had friendly relations with native peoples. They also had some negative ones. So you need to be a little cautious. You got to read them. They had to unload the ship. You careen the ship. That is, you haul it over on one side and repair the bottom. And Drake and his crew were experts at this. This was the kind of thing they did multiple times around the world. I tell people, it's like if you travel on the East Coast, somewhere back on the East Coast, you're going to get your car oil changed, right? Well, this was a big oil change. It's 5 weeks. It's a lot of work. You do it by unloading the ship and then by moving the cargo from side to side. You don't yank on the masts. To yank on the masts would just simply break them.
Drake and his crew spent 5 weeks here repairing their ship, replenishing their supplies, and occasionally interacting with the Coast Miwok, including a trip inland to meet them in their village. Then the crew set out to return to England to deliver their treasure to Queen Elizabeth, a trip that completed his circumnavigation of the globe and took more than a year of intense sailing. In the next segment of the 707, we'll hike along the beach to see the spot that historians believe is the place where Drake arrived nearly 450 years ago. This is KRCB.
KRCB is Sonoma County's NPR station. Wondering what makes us stand out? It's simple, our unwavering commitment to this community. Morning Music, hosted by Brian Griffith, sets the perfect tone for your day.
Brian here with you on Sonoma County's NPR station.
As the sun climbs high, join Doug Jane for Midday Music.
Doug Jane with you, thanks for tuning in.
It's the soundtrack of Sonoma County. Then, stay informed with All Things Considered, featuring insightful reporting from the KRCB newsroom, ensuring you're always in the loop.
For Manzana, the company that helped keep Sebastopol's famous Gravenstein apple alive, their 103rd year in business will be their last.
Your home for the best in local news and music. Because when the community sings, we're here to listen. Your radio, your stories, your station. KRCB 104.9, Sonoma County's NPR station.
Welcome back to the 707 on KRCB. I'm your host, Michelle Marques. After listening to the fascinating history of Sir Francis Drake and how he circumnavigated the globe from 1577 to 1580 with his 5-week stay off the Point Reyes Seashore, our group begins the hike to the very spot where Drake's galleon, the Golden Hind, came to shore to undergo repairs before making the long voyage back to England. The stretch of sandy beach is shrouded in thick fog, and you can't see very far off the coast. Our guide, Michael von der Porten, who is the president of the Drake Navigators Guild, leads us along the shoreline as the waves crash and seabirds hunt and peck for any crabs and other sea life that might make for a good meal.
We'll make a few stops along the way, but we want to talk about why we know Drake was here. As I was already observing, we've got these white cliffs. And on a bright sunny day, they look really white. And they reminded the English of Dover, the White Cliffs of Dover. And that's why they named it New Albion, New White, or New England. So the term New England belongs here. It was then borrowed by those East Coast folks a few years later. When you go through the records, there are more than 50 pieces of evidence that point us to where we are. And of course, 38 degrees north. It runs right through here. The weather. He described the fog as so thick that they couldn't see the sun or stars for 2 weeks. Where's the foggiest point out here? Right here. When they put in the lighthouse out here, they put in a fog station. And they usually put in a fog detector to turn on the foghorn. It's so foggy out here, they just left it on. They talked about the Native Americans. And they talked about the baskets full of feathers that would hold water. You're talking then only about Coast Miwok or Pomo. You've got to be right in this area. So then we get into the porcelains. There are porcelains that have been found out here. So Drake was here in 1579. He had 4 chests of porcelain, and we surmise that they were left here. They did not get back to England. It's confounded by the fact in 1595, there was the first shipwreck in California was right out here, and that was the wreck of Cermeño. This was one of those Spanish galleons I spoke about. They came here, they were in 1595. They pull in here. It is the most obvious harbor. Most of the men are on shore on Lehman Tour Smith across the way, putting together the small boat. Unfortunately, this was November 1595. A storm came in from the south. remember, the west is here, northwest is that way. That's where you expect the winds to come in. They came in from the south. The anchors didn't hold. It dragged anchor and it broke up in the surf. The porcelains from the San Augustine still are found washing ashore, primarily off Lehman Tour Spit. In the Native American sites, Santa Rosa Junior College primarily did archaeology work in the 1970s ahead of builders who were destroying all the Indian sites. Out of there come a number of porcelains. The Native Americans got the porcelains and used them in their own traditional ways. They tried to make beads out of them or pendants or whatever. About 90% of the porcelains that are found come from Cermenho. 10% come from Drake. And we can actually show you which ones they're different. And you can tell by the way they're braided, but you can also tell stylistically and by the paste, by the clay that was used to make the porcelains. So we have this long list of reasons we know Drake was here.
One of the props that von der Porten brought along for the presentation at the Visitor Center is the flag of England, featuring a white background and a red cross. A fellow hiker grabbed the flag and brought it with us along the shore, using it as both an occasional walking stick and as an easy-to-spot banner, leading the group across the sandy beach.
Tom, are you regularly out here on this walk, or is this your first time coming out here?
This is my first walk, yeah.
What brought you out?
I love Drake. I've read a lot of history. It's a fascinating story.
Where are you from?
San Anselmo.
What did you think of the talk today?
It was good. I've seen it before. He's done it at the History Museum, actually. My wife works for the Marine History Museum, so that's how I knew about it.
What do you think of carrying this flag here on the beach?
I love the old English flag, yeah.
Have you visited England before?
Yeah, we were just there, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you look down any Drake history while you were there?
I wanted to go to Plymouth. It's a negotiation. I wanted to go to Plymouth. The wife wanted to go to Ireland, so we went to Ireland this time. But,
Got it. Next time.
Plymouth, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Von der Porten makes another stop along our hike to tell us about some of the historic moments in the life and voyages of Sir Francis Drake.
Established, of course, by being the first person here, he ended up putting up a plaque claiming the land for England, and that's in the records. And so it became the first English claim on what became the United States. This was here on the West Coast, not on the East Coast. The first use of the Book of Common Prayer, the prayer book used by the Anglican Church, was here. The first Protestant church service in what became the United States was here. Probably the first use of the English language in what became the United States. So certainly the first contact with native peoples was up here in Northern California, was here. The first English contact with native peoples was here. And of course, then we had the black people here. We had 4 black people. Talked about Diego, the assistant. Drake would free slaves as he came up the coast. Some of them joined him. He offered employment to some of them. When he got here, he had 3, including this woman, Maria, who was marked as being belonged to one of the other ship captains, one of the Spanish ship captains. So they were here. The 3 blacks were set ashore with supplies to form a colony. If you believe that was the most humane thing to do, that's one way to interpret it. If you believe they were set aside to die, that's another interpretation. In the South Pacific. We actually don't know the specific island. Diego probably died in the South Pacific. Probably died of the injuries he received at Mocha Island. So we have the first black person, one of the first black people in the United States, came as a freed Spanish slave who had been injured and ultimately murdered by Native Americans. History is not simple.
Most of our walk is along the hard-packed sandy beach, but once we reach Drake's Bay, we turn inland to hike to the cove where Drake's ship stopped for repairs. This is now loose sand and much harder to traverse. I talked to a hiker who is taking a moment to catch his breath.
Save the hardest part of the hike for the last? This is not fun.
At one point, I see von der Porten and the others at the head of the group turn a corner, continuing inland, and I mutter under my breath. I can laugh at poor winded Michelle now, but there were still about 800 or so more feet to travel before we stopped at a dune to wait for the rest of the group to arrive. Von der Porten tells us about what we'll see on the other side of the dune.
Okay, so what happened here? Drake pulls in. This sand was open. The water went further in. And in the 1950s, a rancher brought in a bulldozer, moved some sand around to create a freshwater pond for his cattle. So we're actually going to stand basically where the Golden Hind was. We talked, here we're here. They built the fort. The fort was probably built at the base of the hill over there. Native Americans probably came down through a crevice on the far side there. You imagine them coming down by the hundreds, one by one, reforming, and then being allowed into the enclave, into the fort.
We help each other up and over the dune and walk through tall grass to a wooden pole that bears a plaque, and at its base is a marble slab and a rusted anchor.
So this post was put up, and this monument was put up in 1954. That was the 375th anniversary of Drake's visit. That was put up by the Consul General from the UK out of San Francisco. The anchor came from HMS Drake. And in England, a barracks can be an HMS, as in His Majesty's ship. So this came from the barracks, HMS Drake. They had it brought over by the Royal Navy and then delivered here. The plaque is from the 400th anniversary, and that was put up by the Drake Navigators Guild, so you can read that there.
We head back to the shoreline and watch a river otter eye us from the water while we eat lunch and chat before heading back to the visitor center. If you'd like to hear the history yourself and trace Drake's journey, during the summer months, the Drake Navigators Guild hosts free monthly hikes. Google Drake Navigators Guild for more details. I'm your host and producer of this program, Michelle Marques. This show is a service of NorCal Public Media. Our president and CEO is Darren Lachelle.